I started mixing plaster to fill gaps in my rocks. And I'm using this small flexible bowl that's from Woodland Scenics. And I'm using hydrocal plaster. Now I can only mix a very small amount of plaster at a time because by the time I get it applied, it'll already be setting up. So I got, maybe 15 minutes max working time. And I'm starting over here, starting in this section up in here. You can see where I have some fresh plaster up in here. Now one thing I'm doing, as you can see an area here I need to fill, is I'm using junk mail newspaper and I tear it up into pieces. I put it in water. And I use this artist knife and I pack it into the large gaps. So I fill up those large gaps with that junk mail newspaper, and it makes it easier for me to fill in on top with hydrocal. All right, well, I got a small batch of hydrocal mixed up. And you know how it is with projects, just about any kind of project. There's the fun stuff, and then there's the stuff that's just not a lot of fun. And I have to say that this just isn't that much fun. It's pretty tedious. I don't have a lot of working time with this hydrocal, so I gotta keep moving. I do have a little bit of time once it starts to set up where I can carve on it. Now I'm thinking that using the same hydrocal that I cast these rock forms with is going to come to my benefit when I start to paint or stain or whatever I decide to do with these mountains. Now if I do something like a Woodland Scenics acrylic wash, now if I use different types of plaster, well then it would look different. They would stain differently. So if I ended up going that route, if I'm using the same kind of plaster for the rocks and for filling the gaps, well then everything should behave the same way. The downside to that is the short working time. I know there's some plaster that has a longer working time that would be a lot more convenient to work with, but this is what I'm doing. This artist palette knife works really well for this. And I got these off Amazon, and they were pretty cheap. I think I got 4 of them for like $15. So, and the 2 small ones I use a lot when doing this. And the smallest one here is the one I use most of the time. All right, so I've gone as far as I could go with that batch of plaster. It started hardening up. So now I can get in here and carve this a little bit. I'm normally right-handed, but try to work with my left hand so you can see what I'm doing. So we'll get in here and carve this plaster, and I'll try to remove the shapes that are obviously not organic. I have a little bit of time with this. I don't have I don't have an hour. I've probably got 20 minutes or so where I can work on this. And and get things carved. I have all the plaster applied to these rocks to fill in all the gaps. As you can see, it's a little bit messy. Now, what I'll do is I'm going to clean this mess up, and then I'll move everything down to this end and get working on these rocks. Well, getting set up to start working on the corner. Have the track covered up. Have my bridge covered up. Hopefully I won't slop any plaster on my bridge. I have some bits of junk mail newspaper torn up. What I'll do with that is any of these large gaps, I'll get this junk newspaper wet and then I'll stuff it into those gaps. Before I start applying plaster, I have a little container of water here with some torn up newspaper. Take and stuff this up in these gaps. Then when I apply the plaster, I'm not filling all these voids with plaster and just using a bunch of it up for no reason. Well, I have enough paper stuffed into the gaps where I think I can start putting plaster in place. Once I have all the plaster in for the rocks, and then I'll probably smooth off this pink foam and then apply some plaster cloth. I have all the gaps in the rock castings filled. I just finished that up. So the new plaster, it looks a bit gray. After it dries, it should turn the same color as the rock castings. Makes a big mess. Big mess. So the next thing I'm going to do is I have just this little bit of plaster cloth, and I'll be covering up this pink foam up here. And I'll be covering up the pink foam up here. I've applied the plaster cloth to cover up the pink foam up here. And I've also applied the plaster cloth up here and up here, covered up that pink foam. So the next thing I need to do is I need to cut thin strips of pink foam and build up this edge to meet up with the backdrop. Now in hindsight, I probably should have tried to lower this backdrop a little bit more. But what's done is done, so it's there to stay. I've cut some pink foam, and I have it glued in place. So what I'll do now is I'll take my soldering gun with the copper wire loop, and I'll start trimming this pink foam down, and I'll try to blend it into this edge. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I have this soldering gun with this piece of copper here. So I'll just turn on the soldering gun. I'll wait for this to get hot. Probably see a little smoke come off it. All right, I think we're ready to go. Well, I have the pink foam in place and I have it carved to shape. And now it is ready for plaster cloth. I have all the gaps filled in the rock castings. And I have the plaster cloth in place. So now the terrain meets up against the backdrop. I also did the front here by the retaining wall. I have some plaster cloth that bridges the gap here and put a little bit of wet wadded newspaper down in the gaps and covered that up. What I'm thinking about doing now is painting all of the plaster cloth that isn't a rock casting. So I'll paint it the same color brown as this. And that'll be the base color for putting the dirt on top of the plaster cloth. And the rocks will all get painted separately. Now for areas like here, where I have all my rock castings in, I have all the gaps filled, I have the terrain shaped the way I want it, covered in plaster cloth. I can now paint all this plaster cloth with this dark brown base color. And the exact color of this brown, I just picked something from one of the Home Depot color samples, you know, the little color tabs they have. And it's just a dark brown. It's not any specific color. Because it's all going to get covered up. But like I said, if there's a bare spot where I miss, the white plaster cloth's not going to show through. I have painted the inside of my tunnels. And this is primarily so looking inside the tunnel. Of course, once the cover's on, it'll be dark. There's nothing blue or white showing in there. And also painted this side of the tunnel. I painted the back side of the plugs. I mean, these aren't the finest looking insides. I could have finished them a little bit better, but I just didn't see a point in doing that. So I had these plugs sitting out to allow the paint to dry for 24 hours. So when I put the plugs back in, they don't stick. And now you can see with the plugs back in that the tunnel's dark, where before I painted it, I had some blue foam showing here, and white foam here, and white foam here. So that ought to help it a little bit. I may do a little bit more work inside the tunnels sometime down the line, but that won't be anytime real soon. And I have the plug in over here, and the same. You know, I painted the inside here. This was white foam, and I've painted it dark brown, and the same on this side. And the foam on the bottom, that was pink. It's also been painted. You can see that none of my castings have been painted. And that's because this dark brown here is interior flat house paint. And I'm not going to paint my fine castings with house paint. So all my plaster castings here will be painted with model paint. I have a little bit of touching up to do up here, but that's not a real big issue right now. But I painted all these areas brown that will get ground cover. And the reason for that is if I get a bare spot in my ground cover, then white plaster won't show. It'll be dark brown paint, so it won't be noticeable. You see, I got the brown up here. And pretty much everywhere where it's painted brown will first initially get a dirt covering. And then after that, it'll get whatever it does, whether it's static grass or ground foam or whatever it might be. And I have it all painted up to here where my cast rocks end. Well, I'm going to end this video here. What I'm working on now is I'm trying to figure out just what I want to do here. As you can see, I tore down a bunch of what I had built up, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to slant this downwards so it comes closer to meeting this height. I think I'm going to taper the edge a bunch more. I think I'm going to have a pretty gradual slope here. So this will be cut down quite a bit more. And then what I think I'll do is I'll build up the back edge, because I still want to hide a bunch of this stuff here in the back. So that's what I'm thinking right now, but the reality is I'll just see what I end up with, but that's what I'm thinking right now. So I thank you for watching, and I hope you come back and see what I ended up doing with this.